Welcome back to The Income Generation, the show where we provide information for the critical period in people's lives when they're either in or approaching retirement. Each week I help you discover useful actions that serve to make this journey much, much easier. I'm David Scranton, your host. I enjoy this opportunity each Sunday to share with you insight and expertise that I use in my own investment management practice. Insights that you can use as food for thought or as actionable solutions while building or managing your retirement investment plan. We'll do a lot of that in today's show, but we'll also talk about the future of our country because they're both significantly intertwined. We have Steve Forbes coming by a little bit later with his insights. Also, almost all of us can use a little coaching to refine or dramatically improve what we're doing from time to time. In fact, therefore, it should come as no surprise that even our elected officials in Washington can use a little coaching to refine or dramatically improve what they're doing. And that is what today's show is about. We'll look at how the folks inside the Beltway in DC are managing the country, especially when it comes down to finances and budgeting. Then we'll draw some parallels to how you can better manage your budget and your personal finances at home. When I originally conceived this installment of The Income Generation, we were going to call it, Are You Smarter Than a Four-Term Congressman? Now, I know that household finances overall have significantly improved since 2007. In fact, most family finances are much healthier than our country's. Our countries are still seen as being completely out of control. So my viewers already know that they're smarter than a four-term congressman, and you're certainly smarter than a two-term president as well. So I decided that title would be insulting to my intelligent audience. Instead, I did this. I invited someone you can all respect, who's not part of the Washington decision-making process, although he has run for the presidential nomination twice and cares very deeply about what happens to America. It's someone who has written extensively on our issues and the issues that our country faces, and has just completed a new book that I would love to make mandatory reading for every member in Congress. Our nation's issues are not insurmountable. They just need responsible policies. I hear from a variety of people both close to me and in my reading that America as a country cannot prevent its rapid slide. Now, personally, I do not agree. I think we can. But the doomsayers tell us that all great empires have lifespans of about 200 years. They simply cannot maintain their stature for more than a couple of centuries before they begin to crumble under the weight of their own bad decisions. In fact, we're told it's an inevitability that nations on top for too long extend themselves and take on too much debt. They've also spread themselves too thin and generally become content and lazier than they once were. For me, however, it's not much different from the first three Rocky movies from the 70s and the 80s. After a certain stage, the boxer or the country can no longer maintain their drive to sustain greatness in quite the same way they did in the younger version of themselves. This is unless, of course, they take control over the behavior that will cause their demise. Well, I'm sorry that I refuse to believe, like others, that America's fall is preordained or will result from us simply not caring any longer. Once, as a nation, we decide to trim away some of the habits that are pushing us down and begin to institute better fiscal policies, we'll regain that so-called eye of the tiger. We'll begin to hold our heads higher and will remain the undisputed envy of the world. American families did it in their own homes. Now we have to do it as a country. My guest today, Steve Forbes, will share his solution to the biggest problems facing America. Forbes will be here a little later to discuss with us what he sees are the fixes to the country's current direction. In fact, he's written a new book entitled Reviving America: How Repealing Obamacare, Replacing the Tax Code, and Reforming the Fed Will Restore Hope and Prosperity. He explains the problems and how to put you as an American citizen back in control of the decisions that are most important to you. But before we get to Steve Forbes, let me mention an overall important misnomer. Over this and other presidential elections, I've heard some candidates and some political analysts suggest that managing the U.S. economy is like running a business well. You know, I own a business, as you know, Sound Income Strategies. In fact, I own and run several very successful businesses. I've also been hyper aware of everything affecting our economy since the early 1980s. So I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that my opinion on this is also credible. The question, of course, is whether running a business and running the country is a good comparison. So today we go down the road to better understand the U.S. economy, some of what causes the roadblocks to expansion, and the problems with the national budget. Believe me when I say that comparing the process of Congress creating a national budget, saying it's much like creating a budget for a business, is actually overcomplicating it. The better comparison, I believe, is much more basic. The national focus should be similar to the focus that you've made at home. Basics like keeping expenses down, minimizing frivolous purchases, and making sure that if you're going to spend money, you're doing it in the right places. Then there's the biggie, not going deeper and deeper into debt. So pay maybe just a little bit of attention to the doomsayer's message, because the economy is still headed in a bad direction. But use that message as incentive to heighten the importance of making the turning point right now. Because the longer our national economic health declines, the more difficult the revival. I'm certain that what happened to all other great nations that came before us doesn't have to happen to us. We have the resources and the talent to stay well above average. Am I saying it cannot happen here? Absolutely not. It can happen here. But I don't see it happening, not with our bloodline of grit and determination. That grit and determination lies within our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, of people who had a burning need to make a difference in their lives, even when it meant crossing hostile oceans, working 3 jobs to put kids through college, or the guts to just run from their own declining nations. Let's face it, Americans are a pedigree of strong-willed and stubborn men and women who will do whatever it takes for the future. This is the DNA of the United States. The very nature of being American means that somewhere in our lineage we have a winner spirit and a survivor's blood. Additionally, the U.S. has brilliant scientists, ingenious businessmen, and those capable of funding great ideas. It provides a home for the next great ideas, which of course leads to improved living and more jobs. We need to make sure this country isn't inviting these members to leave the United States by creating an environment more oppressive than is available elsewhere in the world. Our country can indeed be different from those before us that lost their greatness, those like the Roman or British empires. But as I hope to touch on in my conversation with Steve Forbes, not if we do stupid things. An example of fiscal stupidity is adding expensive luxury items to the economy while it's still ailing. And this is exactly what was done with the Affordable Health Care Act. Now, please don't get me wrong. Providing affordable health care is a very noble initiative for any administration. But adding luxury expenses to an economy, experiencing its worst years since the Great Depression, this is like deciding to buy a vacation home just after you've lost your job. If you're not using someone who's well-trained in fixed income and you're born before 1966, it may just be time for you to break up with that advisor and move on. I would suggest someone who will care for you through these important years of your life. If you need help finding someone, call or write us. I'd also like to remind you of the special report entitled The Income Generation. This is available free to you, our loyal viewers, online. If you haven't downloaded your report, pick it up after the show. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. I do believe that all of the great nations throughout history, if anyone is capable of avoiding financial disaster, it's us. But I also know it doesn't look that way when you consider the mess that we're in today. Our national debt is out of control. We've gotten our economy and financial markets dangerously addicted to artificial stimuli. As a result, I personally see 2 diametrically opposed possible outcomes. One is the possibility of further deterioration of the current deflationary trends. The other is that we may just be teetering on the brink of not just another stock market crash, but of a change in our global status that could trigger hyperinflation. And that's something you really need to be aware of as an investor, one extreme or the other with very little in between. So in today's market breakdown, I'm going to talk about how we got into this mess and what we need to do to get out of it. A little bit later, I'll talk about what you can do to protect yourself in the meantime. In my first book, Stop Financial Insanity, I coined the phrase monetary alchemy. I used it to describe some of the innovative investment theories that economists developed back in the 1950s and 60s to supposedly mitigate the risk of investing in the stock market. Many of these strategies are still being used by financial advisors right now, today, even though they have failed investors 3 times since 1998. Even though these economists were able to prove their theories on paper, in the real world, monetary alchemy has not been so successful. Yes, it protected investors when things got a little bad, but failed to protect them when things got really bad, which of course is when they needed that protection the most. I mention this because what our government has been doing since 2008 could very well be considered to be another form of monetary alchemy, or more accurately, economic alchemy. As a theoretical formula, quantitative easing may have worked beautifully, but in the real world, it has not worked nearly as well. One reason for that is the same reason that those brilliant investment theories have not worked well as in practice as they have on paper. It's because the financial markets and the economy aren't driven just by numbers. They're driven to a large extent by emotion. Investment decisions are driven largely by the 2 human emotions of fear and greed. And emotions are something you simply cannot control or manipulate with monetary alchemy. So how does that apply to quantitative easing and where we are today? Well, here's one example. One of the goals of quantitative easing was to create inflation. In theory, a certain amount of inflation is good for the economy, although I don't necessarily agree with that. In fact, before the 1930s, we had approximately 150 years in this country with virtually 0 inflation. What I would call permanent inflation began when our government first went into permanent debt. Now, one well-known textbook definition of inflation is as follows: too much money chasing too few goods and services. Some financial textbooks also say that putting more money into circulation, which is exactly what quantitative easing did, will help create inflation. Consumers will use the money to buy goods and services, thereby driving up prices. As the demand increases, manufacturers will have to create more products. That means more jobs will open up, corporations will grow, and so on and so forth. It's all good in theory. But what the financial textbooks don't consider is what happens if that surplus money that went into circulation doesn't get spent. What if consumers are in a place emotionally where they're afraid to spend? What if instead they use that money to pay down debts, to rebuild their savings? In other words, to be fiscally responsible, right? Let's face it, a lot of people's savings were wiped out after the collapse of the housing market and 2 major stock market crashes since the year 2000. Well, to some extent, this is exactly what has happened with quantitative easing. The result, rather than inflation, has been a trend toward deflation. And not just here domestically. Governments throughout the Western world have been battling deflation. And while you can make the theoretical argument that inflation might be good for the economy to a moderate level, I simply cannot make any positive case for deflation. Deflation creates an economic domino effect in the wrong direction. Why? You see, when people save, invest, or pay down debt with surplus money instead of spending it, the demand for new goods does not increase, it actually decreases. Companies get stuck with excess inventory. Manufacturing declines, workers get laid off, and of course, the spiral starts downward. It makes matters worse and worse and worse. So just as moderate inflation theoretically can create an upward climb that helps the economy grow, deflation almost certainly creates a downward spiral that hurts it. If you tuned in a few weeks ago, you heard my guest economist Harry Dent talk about the dangers of deflation. In fact, he's been talking about it for years, and so have I. In fact, I wrote in 2008, before the first tranche of quantitative easing started, what we called the TARP program, that deflation was one of its potential dangers. Now, 8 years later, a lot of other analysts are finally saying the same thing. Unfortunately, though, the use of economic alchemy has not only continued during those 8 years, it's gone global. It seems that other nations are willing to follow our example even when we set a bad one. Europe launched its own quantitative easing program back in March of 2015. Our financial markets have been feeding off it ever since because our own QE program ended in October of 2014. But that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. After 6 years, our stock market and economy have grown dependent on artificial stimulus. I've likened it to a drug. In 2008, I called it caffeine for the economy and said it would become addictive. As the program continued and the doses increased, I started to call it economic steroids. And now, even though the Fed has stopped the injections, our markets remain addicted because of this steroid booster shot coming over from Europe. As I explained on an earlier show, this booster shot has created a leveling effect for our long-term interest rates. It's kept long-term rates artificially low and the stock market artificially inflated, just like our own QE program had done for 6 years. I also explained that this is the reason the Federal Reserve simply cannot raise short-term interest rates very much. You see, hiking short-term rates while long-term rates are being suppressed will flatten out something which we call the yield curve. This could add to our concerns of a deflationary spiral. But the even scarier scenario in all of this is the threat of the opposite of deflation, which is hyperinflation, as I mentioned earlier. Consider what might happen if the steroid booster from Europe wears off suddenly, or if sections of the Eurozone go into default despite quantitative easing. It could cause all global currencies that have been manipulated through quantitative easing to become devalued, including the US dollar. Devaluation could be particularly profound if the rating agencies reduce our credit rating even further. And if that happens, we could lose our status as the world reserve currency. The result would be that deflation turns into hyperinflation. And that's a scenario that could be devastating for the stock market, as well as the US economy overall. Already in the past year, one of the major bond rating services has dropped its rating on US government bonds. If that trend continues, it could also be a major problem. Unfortunately, the Fed's policies and practices over the past 7 years are reflective of our government's seemingly increasingly bad fiscal habits overall. Our total national debt now stands at over $18 trillion and has been at crisis levels since the year 2011. But rather than make any real effort to get spending under control, our so-called leaders have raised the debt ceiling again and again and have slammed us with taxes, hoping that future revenues will somehow magically catch up to our expenses. As anyone with a household budget knows, that's a doomed strategy. You can't just keep increasing expenses, spending, hoping and praying that it gets covered with future salary raises. And as a government, you cannot set tax rates indiscriminately. At too high of a rate, people become demotivated. At too low a rate, your revenue isn't sufficient. Somewhere in the middle is the sweet spot, and I think our guest today, Steve Forbes, may just have some additional thoughts about what that ideal tax rate is. Later in the show, Marty is going to talk about how this unfortunate trend toward bad bookkeeping by our U.S. government, how it's evolved, and how it's gotten worse, particularly over the last 80 years. Now, one of the few silver linings in the subprime mortgage crisis and subsequent housing market collapse was that many of you learned a hard lesson about financial recklessness. Since then, many have gotten your own budgets and balance sheets in order, or at least are working on it. Now our political leaders who have not yet learned this lesson have to look toward it. Let's hope it doesn't take another crisis or collapse before they do.
Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle, 7 core values to help protect your money in good times and bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Available now.
I'm here with Steve Forbes, publisher, business icon, highly patriotic American, and author of many books including his latest, Reviving America, How Repealing Obamacare, Replacing the Tax Code, and Reforming the Fed Will Restore Hope and Prosperity. Steve, it's a great pleasure having you on the show.
Good to be with you, Dave. Thank you.
You're welcome. I want to start with the first thing, which is repealing Obamacare. In your book, you talk about how that's almost essential to restoring us to hope and prosperity. Talk about that for a moment, please.
Well, the key thing is getting the patient in charge of health care instead of these third-party payers that we've had for decades. And we propose several reforms to do it. Yes, you got to get rid of Obamacare, the employer mandate, the individual mandate, but you need other reforms as well. Removing mandates on what should be insurance policies so people can choose policies that fit their needs. I don't need pregnancy services, thank you very much, so the bureaucrats shouldn't force me to buy it. Another thing, nationwide shopping for health insurance. So you have hundreds of companies competing for your business. Have clinics and hospitals have to post their prices, so you have true transparency. So you can see if one hospital charges $3,000 for an MRI, one does $300, right. So you can choose and save your money. Also, the hospital should be required to post each month how many patients die from infections they received after they entered the hospital. So people can begin to judge what's a good institution, what isn't a good institution.
Sure.
You put reforms like these together, you get transparency, more consumerism, and put the patient in charge. When the patient's in charge and you have effective safety nets, then you get more entrepreneurship, and there's a lot of it bursting at the seams in healthcare. And you get what you have in any other free market. You get more for less, more innovation, and better safety nets. We do it with food. If people have problems getting food, we have everything from food banks to food stamps to deal with it. Why not with health care, such as high-risk pools and the like?
That sounds like a good plan. I like it. Now, obviously, the other side of the coin is to have a better plan, maybe one with a more efficient cost structure. Then the other side of it is how we pay for even that much. And it's the revenue side, the taxes. And I know I followed you now for about 30 years and your theories about taxes. The concept of the flat tax. Tell us where you think the ideal tax rate should be right now for Americans. What would be the tax rate that gives people incentive to work harder and make more, but at the same time brings enough revenue to balance the budget?
Well, the key is get this economy moving. And as you indicated, you don't want to put burdens on people who want to do productive work, risk-taking, achieve success. And the flat tax does that. Single rate, we've proposed a rate in the book at 17%. Generous exemptions for adults and for children. For example, a family of 4, your first $52,000 free of federal income tax, no tax on savings, no death taxes. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. Or as our founders would say, no taxation without respiration.
Right.
Do the same thing on the business side, lower it to 17% from 35%. Instant expensing of capital expenditures for tax purposes. If you have a loss, you carry it forward. You do that, not only does it mean a better economy, but also means more in terms of a better life. Just think of it, the IRS estimates we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. We spend $300 billion a year conforming with this crazy code that nobody understands. They just go back 20 years, a generation. Imagine if all those tens of billions of hours, trillions of dollars, had been used for creating new products and services, new medical devices, new cures for diseases. How much better our lives would be if all that brain power had been applied productively. So it's a moral issue, not just a GDP economic issue, it's a moral issue. And in terms of balancing the budget, ultimately the flat tax brings in much more revenue as it kicks in. But the key thing also is reducing or at least holding the line on a lot of government spending. Government does not create resources. Government takes resources, can redistribute them, spend them, but they don't create it.
Correct.
We, the people, create the resources.
That's right. That's right. You know, I remember back when President Reagan put in Tax Reform Act in 1986 was the closest we had ever gotten to having a flat tax. Back then we had two brackets. We had 15% and 28%. Steve, you had told me that you thought that the reason President Reagan's plan failed was because it had two levels instead of just one. I thought, gee, that's not so bad. We give some lower income earners a little bit of a break. Your answer is to take people under $52,000 and have them pay no taxes, which in some ways is even better. Talk about why you think that failed just a little bit.
Well, two things about the 86 Act. One is they left the code in place, even though they cleared out a lot of tax shelters, which was a miracle. The basic code was in place. And so like a monster in a movie, it came out of the swamp again. And having more than one rate, when you have more than one rate, I like to say it's like putting two rabbits together. They multiply. It's very easy to add a third and fourth rate when you have two. Whereas if you have one, it's a huge national debate if you want to change it or you want to add another bracket. So clean the thing out, throw the code away. It's beyond redemption. We should have learned that from the experience of the 1980s. Since 1986, it's been changed at least 15,000 times. So it becomes a plaything for Washington politicians. So have a simple code so you can literally fill it out on a piece of paper or a few keystrokes on your computer, and in one bracket, and have generous exemptions for kids and for adults, so that way lower income people are not going to be hurt by this thing. And in terms of, your first 50, if you're a family of four, first $52,000 for your federal income tax, above that only 17 cents on the dollar above that. So low rate, you have the incentives there to grow the economy, boom, we're off to the races.
That's great. I want to switch gears one more time. I want to talk about the Federal Reserve a little bit. You have some interesting points about how the Federal Reserve really needs to be changed in a significant way.
Absolutely. The Fed has become a monster, taking on huge powers that was never intended when the thing was created over 100 years ago. The Fed, in addition to providing government services, for banking services for the government, for the Treasury Department, should have only two functions. One is a stable dollar. The other is dealing quickly and decisively when you have the occasional financial panic.
Right.
And in terms of a stable dollar, you know, you want the dollar works best. Money works best when it has a fixed value. You know, money is not wealth. Money measures wealth the way scales measure weight, or a ruler measures length. And money's like a claim check. You know, you go to the restaurant, you have a coat check because you check your coat in. The coat check has no value. It's a claim on, in this case, your coat. Money's a claim on products and services. So if it keeps changing in value, then it's very hard to do investing. Investing, as you know, is risky enough.
Especially now when you invest across borders, you know, like we used to do just by walking in your stockbroker's office.
And so it hurts the economy. So you know, imagine just for a moment, if the Federal Reserve was in charge of clocks. They floated the clocks. They have 60 minutes an hour one day, 40 minutes the next, 80 minutes the day after. Life would be chaotic. Imagine baking a cake. It says bake the batter 30 minutes. You have to figure out those inflation-adjusted minutes, nominal minutes, a New York minute, a Mexican minute. It'd be chaotic. The same is true of money.
Our producers wouldn't like us very much. We'd never be able to get the advertisements in, you know, because we'd always be going over on time. Steve, I want to take this opportunity for thanking you very, very much for being on the show. I've always been a huge fan of yours, and as I did my introduction, we spent some great time here today with Steve Forbes, who I consider to be an extremely patriotic American. I think the world of you. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. We'll be back in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned on the station. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation, again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Thank you, Marty. Abraham Lincoln once said, "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." This is as true now as it was then. Our ancestors believed this when they left their homelands to build a better life, not to have one handed to them. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do. Our tax system, as we heard from Steve Forbes, is in need of drastic re-engineering. In its current condition, our tax laws put business, and as a result, American workers, at a tremendous disadvantage. So how can our companies compete with overseas competitors, especially when our tax laws impose the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world? We need to get smart about this. Other countries have. Both Japan and the United Kingdom have taken steps to cut corporate taxes. These are steps our country should take right now. If we don't, the hard reality, or to paraphrase Al Gore, the inconvenient truth, is that U.S. businesses are often much more valuable in the hands of foreign companies. Corporate profits immediately rise as they reduce their tax bill by foreign ownership. Management's job, let's not forget, is to maximize shareholder value. Our tax code actually twists their arm and makes them look to move overseas just to fulfill their promise to shareholders and do their job. And large corporations headed across the ocean or to Canada are becoming the trend. It's no wonder foreign takeovers of U.S. companies doubled last year to $275 billion. So until we change this, we can keep waving goodbye. The problem with all this, of course, is when corporations and corporate headquarters leave the U.S. in a takeover or what's called a corporate inversion, jobs can quickly follow. Loss of jobs, of course, means less economic activity. The next step, obviously, is that the stock market follows a downward path. It takes investors with it. Quantitative easing, these booster shots, as I call them, was what wound up creating a leveling effect for various maturity bonds. It artificially lowered interest rates across all maturities. Investors trying to earn more interest than these rates allowed simply threw up their hands and said, well, I might as well invest in the stock market. This increased demand for stocks, as irrational as it might be, lifted their price levels. At one point through quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve was buying $85 billion in bonds from the public each and every month. Now that quantitative easing ended in October of 2014, that doesn't mean that much of that stimulus money used to purchase these bonds is out of the economy now. Why? Because the bonds they purchased during QE to pump more money into the economy have not yet matured. So although the new purchases have ended, the bonds they have purchased are still outstanding. As long as these bonds have not matured, that stimulus money is still in the economy. So quantitative easing money will remain in the market for many years to come, even though the program itself has ended. Our representatives that we've sent to Washington to act on our behalf have to better manage our country's debt. The debt ceiling is supposed to be the upper limit of what the U.S. can borrow. It was originally put into place so the country could quickly borrow just in case it had to. In recent years, it's become viewed as a hindrance to a government with an insatiable appetite for borrowing and spending. And we shouldn't borrow what we cannot afford to repay. Acting responsibly means not financing more than you could pay back. This is the golden rule of borrowing. It doesn't matter if you're a college student, a retiree, or a U.S. citizen. In August of 2011, one of the most recognized credit rating agencies dropped the U.S.'s Treasury credit rating from AAA. They indicated that they no longer believed U.S. Treasuries were considered among the safest investments in the world. One of the ratios they look at is their ability to repay. Our government currently has $13.6 trillion of its debt held by the public, including those of foreign countries. If the world becomes leery of our ability to pay back the matured debt as it comes due, we could quickly be in the same position as Greece. Let's make sure we don't do this to ourselves. How? It starts in the voting booth. Being responsible means choosing leaders who will say no. No to legislation that generates debt-financed spending that we cannot afford to repay. We need to make sure our leaders understand that you simply cannot incentivize the main drivers of the economy to pack up and leave the United States. We owe it to our ancestors who came here so we could have a better life. And we owe it to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren who shouldn't get stuck holding the bag. It's funny, but the original colonists, if you think about it, protested in Boston in 1773 with what was called the Boston Tea Party. The overall reason for this, of course, was what they called taxation without representation. Let me ask you, if the U.S. government is borrowing money today that will be repaid by our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, isn't this a form of taxation without representation? Let's face it, we obviously cannot grant voting rights to the unborn, so we have to stop our borrowing and mounting of debt. Financing a lifestyle today at the expense of others goes against our heritage. These are things we've always stood against since before we were a country. In many ways, it's the reason we became a country. Within the United States, we're witnessing a migration of individuals from high-tax states to lower-tax states. Often the move is being led by the highest income earners. On the national level, there's nothing to prevent highly taxed citizens from doing the same. That is, move to countries with lower tax rates. As I mentioned earlier, U.S. companies are already relocating. It's been 30 years now since we've had a major tax reform in the United States for individuals. Most don't question that somewhere between 0 and 100%, there's an optimum tax rate for economic activity and tax collection. It's a level low enough to encourage spending and investment, at a level that stimulates activity and collects enough to run the government. I don't believe we're there now, and clearly neither does our guest, Steve Forbes. Inflation over the past several years has been tame. We're all, however, at a risk of a couple of different scenarios which may alter that. If the United States does not get its fiscal house in order, we're at the risk of losing our world reserve currency status. This could create hyperinflation with price increases that would create significant disruptions and perhaps even consumer goods shortages, as we've seen in other countries. Inflation hedges, as Steve Forbes said, inflation hedges such as gold were popular back when the U.S. was on the gold standard, but gold can no longer be relied on to increase in value during inflationary periods. So there is no natural or easy way I can think of to hedge yourself against hyperinflation. So if you can't hedge against the worst case scenario, as I said that I hope and pray every day won't come true in the United States of America, then why not protect against the other contingency, deflation, the one that I believe to have a greater mathematical probability of happening. This is what happens when asset levels begin dropping in price. Since 2007, the Fed has been very wary of assets beginning to lose value. This could include stocks, real estate, as well as other hard assets like automobiles. There is a hedge that's worked well to protect against this type of deflation. What is it, you ask? Investing in fixed income strategies. See, fixed income strategies pay a consistent income whose buying power therefore actually increases with deflation. And that, folks, is what this show is all about. Strategies for you, the income generation. I'd like to thank Steve Forbes for coming on my show. I urge you to read his book. When I did, I found myself at first furious. But then once I calmed down, I found myself inspired. Let me know if you have the same reaction by going to soundincomestrategies.com and leaving a message. While you're there, why not sign up for a chance to win a signed copy of Steve Forbes' Reviving America, How Repealing Obamacare, Replacing the Tax Code, and Reforming the Fed Will Restore Hope and Prosperity. Once again, I'd like to thank Marty Johnson for her report on the Federal Reserve and its history, and how their reach has overgrown and morphed over time to be something much larger than originally intended. On deck for next week, we have American financial analyst, stockbroker, author, and one-time Senate candidate, Peter Schiff. We'll dig into where Peter sees the economy going, as well as investments and what to avoid. I'm looking forward to one-on-one with Peter Schiff, as his warnings in the past have unfortunately become today's reality. By the way, have you made it over to theincomegeneration.com, to our website, to get the special report we've created just for Income Generation members? We only have so much time each week, so we simply cannot cover everything. So along with some of the investment professionals at Sound Income Strategies, we've compiled this 22-page report. During the 5 to 10 minutes you'll spend indulging yourself in this report, you may discover many new questions you could be asking yourself now to help in retirement. All free to you, my loyal viewers. So if you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and get the special report now. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Look forward to seeing you next Sunday.